everyone. I hope you all are doing well. Just a quick disclaimer for this conversation this week. I'm a little under the weather, so I'm sorry if my voice is a little shaky or if I cough at any point. But I did want to be able to share with you all, this lecture on our last week of class discussion and not leave you all hanging. But yeah, so this week we're rounding out our class by thinking about a particular social institution that involves, various forms of inequality in its own right, and that is the internet. So thinking about how the internet can be seen as a social institution with its own patterns of belief, with its own behavior norms that characterize how people interact with one another, how people see one another as social subjects, how people perceive themselves and present themselves in, various curated ways. So thinking about how we can engage sociological analysis in understanding how the internet impacts, our various, social norms. So first of all, we're thinking about, how we can understand the internet as involving, various gendered expectations. So, a key way to start thinking about that is, the various gender norms that come into play with posting. So thinking about, the various, ways that people engage with digital spaces and, what content they choose to post and how that can very much be shaped by, different folks' understandings of masculinity and femininity and, how different ways of expressing masculinity and femininity can be subverted in those spaces. So yeah, thinking about digital space, thinking about the internet as being this prime site where, various forms of social inequalities can both be reinforced in different ways as well as challenged. So one of our readings for this week thinks through, how the internet functions as a social institution and how different norms of behavior, patterns of belief come into play to reproduce social inequalities in dating apps specifically. So Molly Niesen in the piece Love Inc. interrogates the ways that, we can understand different dating apps like, Tinder, like Bumble, thinking about all of these various apps that have emerged and how key it is to understand them through an intersectional lens. So in other words, thinking about the various ways that, how people express their desires and identities, how people interact with one another, how people express themselves, how that can be met with reproducing different forms of social inequalities in the form of like non-consensual fetishization, exoticizing different identities, thinking about different forms of, misogyny that will take shape as well as, different forms of transphobia that will come into play, in dating app interactions and, thinking about how important it is to, look at these apps through a framework that thinks about race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and all of the various ways that, these different dimensions of identity and experience characterize people's engagement with the apps, as well as, different forms of marginalization that they can experience in the apps. So, it's interesting how different apps have been trying to, intervene in the ways that inequalities take shape on their app. So, people may be familiar with the efforts called Kinder Grinder, where it was like essentially this educational campaign that Grinder took on that, shared different videos around, like what is fat phobia, what is transphobia, and, shared different users' experiences with those forms of marginalization on the app. So it can do this work of, trying to help different users understand, how marginalization, can come up on the apps. But, it does raise the question of, thinking about to what extent awareness campaigns can meaningfully intervene in, these different forms of marginalization and how everyday social norms and practices are really, at times replicated in digital spaces. So thinking about you need to change, various, material social norms. So in other words, how social norms and practices take shape in everyday life, in-person interactions, and think about that occurring in tandem with, digital spaces and how marginalization takes shape. So in other words, you can't really think about how, in-person realities, material realities take shape without, at this point thinking about the ways that digital spaces impact that and vice versa. So in other words, these classic distinctions of online and offline mean less at this particular juncture of our digital era, because we see how digital spaces, do this work of, informing how people understand different levels of inequality, how they reproduce different levels of inequality, and so on. So, we're also thinking about, how does inequality how can we intervene? Excuse me, my under the weatherness is coming up. So we're also thinking about how meaningful interventions can take shape in digital spaces, and with that, thinking about what are obstacles to different intersectional social movements gaining steam. So Francesca Sobande, one of our authors for this week, she discusses the ways that we see different companies co-opting different social movements in today's day and age, and trying to engage these social movements for different levels of monetary value. So in other words, thinking about the ways that social movements can be capitalized on. And we see this, for instance, folks may be familiar with how this took shape in the 2020 uprising, where we saw a lot of companies kind of seize this moment of attempts to intervene in social inequalities as a way to boost their own brands. So with that, trying to co-opt different dimensions of social movements as, so in other words, when we say co-opting social movements, trying to, take on those social movements and engage them for their own profits. So, to boost their own profit margins. So, Francesca Sobande, highlights really key dimensions of this and how we see it take shape, and points out the ways that different companies will focus on different subject positions. So thinking about the ways that, the ways that these different narratives of like the white savior come up in, different campaigns that, companies will take on. So thinking about, the various advertisements, thinking about the different forms of branding that will try to engage this idea of, social movements being, connected to different forms of charity. So instead of thinking, in other words, about social movements as, requiring systemic change. So instead of thinking about movements as requiring different levels of structural change, it focuses on individual subject positions and thinks about, how various folks have overcome different obstacles. So, she talks about this in relation to like the Black excellence trope as well, and thinking about how that can do this work of diverting attention from, how systemic change and structural change can happen, and instead focuses on how individuals have overcome different levels of social inequality. So she makes this argument that, by companies kind of, using this, trope of individualism, using this trope of, different people overcoming systemic obstacles, it actually diverts attention from the necessity of movement building. So it diverts attention from the necessity of collective change that needs to happen in order to change oppressive forces. So in other words, thinking about how key it is to, build those grassroots movements where people are like taking to the streets, creating different forms of change, pushing back against the ways that can be co-opted into profiteering schemes. So the ways that, different movements can then be subsumed by, different capitalist forces to essentially just make money and, not be able to have the same power that, they would have if folks were not so focused on those individual narratives. So, it is important to point out that, Francesca Sobande is, looking at this issue as a both and. So in other words, she's thinking about how, we can both see companies engaging different forms of, social change rhetoric and doing that to impact people's consciousness and essentially creating an entry point for people to, get involved in different social movements. But what's dangerous is when the buck stops there in terms of, awareness raising, but instead thinking about how awareness can be a catalyst to different forms of collective action. So we can't kind of limit the rhetoric of social change to be, just for the sake of generating economic value for different capitalist forces, but instead thinking about how those larger structures that are continuously reproducing different levels of social stratification can be subverted. So we're talking about these articles, on the discussion board this week, and I really do look forward to hearing, what folks think about the various subject positions that Francesca Sobande discusses, and thinking about the different advertisements and media that she directs us towards in order to, think through the impact of kind of narrowing conversations about social change to, these different discourses of individuality. But yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful week. I'm going to go get some cough drops, and I hope you all are wonderful.